Glad to see everybody out. Yep, just got it on. So I have today's lesson number 4 on competence. I got a couple copies left for anybody that needs some. So is it Miss Pat? And I've got copies of lesson 5 that should be printing now. I had to go load up the copy machine with paper, and so it should be printing. That's all good. So today's lesson is on competence, and we're going to be looking at examples of Abraham, Hezekiah, and then the qualifications of elders and deacons. And as we go, maybe I'll get a volunteer towards the end of the class to go check the copy machine and bring the copies for next week's lesson out if we have it. So as we go through, I hope these lessons are encouraging. And again, all these are should be all tying together. We have these qualities of leadership. And again, that's not management training or anything, but we could all display leadership in our lives as Christians. And we never know when opportunity is going to come up, so we always got to be ready for it. But these things tie together. Today we're studying competence. But if you think about the previous lessons, where you have courage, where you have conviction, communication ability, you can't really have competence without some of the previous things that we studied, right? So let's start this lesson just by talking about what does that mean? What does competence mean? How do we define that? Yep, you're able to do things. Brandon, your hand was going up also. Capable, and then can't. Responsible. Responsibility is a big part of it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Yeah, so it's one thing to be able to say that you're going to do something, but then do actually do it. So we talked about, previously conviction, doing things that you say you're going to do, believing what you say you believe, and then competence is being able to deliver results in various ways. Sorry? Organization's a big part of that. I've got something in my notes later on. Bill says organization's part of it. You ever hear the phrase, you get what you plan for? Going back to organization, you don't really fail. You don't make a plan to fail. How's that phrase go? You fail to make a plan and you'll fail. So competence, I think we could all agree, is you're able to do what you want to do. And not everybody's going to be competent at everything. We all have different strengths. So I think we got to avoid the thought that if we're going to be a competent Christian or a leader, we've got to be good at everything. You have to identify your skills and you have to use those, just like Paul writes in Corinthians about members of the body having their own strengths and weaknesses that we got to work together with. So spiritually, what does competence look like in action? Excuse me. As Joyce says, competence in action is doing what you say you're going to do, setting out to do it. People will see what you're doing. When I think about specific actions that might require competence in a spiritual setting, it's the ability to show up regularly, be part of the assembly. Before we talk about everybody's specific jobs and strengths and weaknesses in the body, you got to be part of the body. You got to show up. You got to be reliable. If we put our competence to action, I think about people that, go visiting, comfort people, write notes, all those things that you need to get out of your comfort zone to go and talk to people. You have to have some competence to go and do some of those acts of benevolence. You got to be competent for Bible study. If somebody wants to study one-on-one or lead a class, you have to be competent, and you got to be a student to be able to teach and to share the Bible studies. Worship services, one needs to be competent when we are leading the worship. It takes experience. One of the reasons why we're trying to get the teenage boys in rotation is get them some seasoning, get them practice, give them some mentorship, because these things, you don't just wake up one day and start doing it. So a lot of ways that we think about being competent, or what we need to show competence in. A lot of the one-on-one stuff that people don't always see, and then often the public part of worship also need to be competent in. But I think overall, no matter what part of the body you're in spiritually, a competent person is going to identify a need and step up to fill it. Again, that need might be a one-on-one spiritual need for encouragement or comfort, or that need might be more organizational, or that need might be more, structural within the church here, something that requires planning, organization, and follow-up. So when I think about spiritual competence, to boil it down, what does competence look like spiritually? It's somebody that uses their skills and experience to help others, I think. I'm not only just using those skills, but also using the skills in a humble and gracious way. I'm not saying I'm confident, I'm in charge, look at me go and help some people out. I'm confident, I'm in charge, look at me go and lead a worship service, or anything like that. Your skills don't matter too much if you don't use them for anything. Is these better machines up? Oh. Sorry. I'm sorry. Thanks for having that attention.
Will you give Dan a couple of copies of your lesson? Thank you.
You bet. It's my coffee. I'm sure we have people that are competent at the coffee machine if we need some pick-me-up. All right, so what does competence look like spiritually? Using your experience and knowledge to help others in a gracious, humble way. But then also being dependable, being trustworthy, not having to worry that somebody's going to do what they say they're going to do. So competence is going to be really important, as an individual, but then also for the health of the group, to be able to have some follow through and action that's going to help others.
It's the ability to carry out any action of obedience, any and all actions of obedience. So the only way you can do that is if you understand the scripture. So it does include helping others, but it also includes doing what God would have us do. If you're confident to do that, you're kind of in trouble anyway.
Yep.
So it's any and all actions of obedience, which you don't understand if you do not.
Yep. And that's a great point. Thank you. And I'll paraphrase that so good here. Is basically adding more depth to what I was saying, is using your abilities to be obedient, to do the actions that God requires of us. And that's good. I phrase it as experience to help others. I'm focusing on the local immediate needs, but there's also the greater needs of obedience, and we got to be competent to do that. There is expectations for following the pattern, doing things decently and in order. But yeah, we need to be competent in what we do. If we think about it, if we truly put following God as a priority, we don't want to do anything halfway or incomplete, or in a what's the right word to use? Low quality manner, I guess. We got to show competence. And again, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes takes time, experience to develop some skills, to be obedient and to help others. So, somebody who's competent, does the way they use their skills depend on how they're feeling for the day? Yep, I hear a lot of no's. One of the things that makes competent people stand out is, no matter how you feel, having a good day or a bad day, you're still going to put your best foot forward. And, Paul makes comparisons with athletes, and I think we could do the same thing. If you're watching, a winning Super Bowl team, do the winners make excuses? Like, I wasn't feeling good that day, I didn't put my best foot forward, or I didn't get enough sleep. You don't hear the winners making excuses like that. Does that mean that everybody on the winning team feels perfect all the time? No, it means that they're able to go and show up and put some things to the side and do the best job they could do, even if they're going through difficulties. So spiritually, then we need to strive to do the same thing. Your attendance on Sunday morning shouldn't depend on if you're in a good mood or a bad mood. You need to show up. Make sure we aren't making excuses and putting other things at a higher priority. Another aspect in the book here, highly competent people also search continually for ways to keep learning and growing and improving. An athlete, professional athlete, do they just get to a plateau and say, well, I'm not going to the gym anymore? I won the Super Bowl, so I don't need to train anymore. As Christians, we should never stop learning. We have people that have been going to Bible class for many decades, but they still keep showing up and keep learning. You keep growing. You always keep searching for more and more of that spiritual solid meat. Questions, thoughts, comments on that?
I've got guys that work for me, and I'll say, go with him and learn how to do this particular thing. And they'll say, I know how to do that. And I'm like, what's wrong with going and finding another way of doing it? Maybe you know something really different, better than you. Some people just don't. I know offhand, I don't want to know. That's incompetent. You don't want to learn.
Yep, that's a good point that Kent makes. So real life example, you guys on the job site that think that they're through learning, that's a quick way to find out some hard learned lessons or the hard way. If you think that you're done learning, if you think you already understand everything.
I think the Bible never stop.
Yep.
You always pick up something every time you pick it up.
Yep, and Bill's comment is you could learn something new every time you pick up the Bible. It's designed to never stop learning. God gave us basically an infinitely deep well of knowledge that we could always be drawing from. So, as a Christian, if we're going to continuously build competence, of course, we need to be active, we need to show up, we need to never stop learning. I see, videos online all the time about self-proclaimed Bible experts where they're talking about things that are just foolish and far out, and they don't come from the Bible at all. There's a lot of self-proclaimed fools that think they're competent, but because they aren't learning and studying the truth, they're just showing their ignorance instead of showing their competence. Unfortunately, a lot of people want to follow that, but that's another discussion altogether. So if we're going to be spiritual leaders, we need to make sure we are competent. That doesn't happen overnight. Keep attending, keep encouraging, keep fellowshipping, keep studying. Always keep sharpening the sword and learning more spiritually. So competence is one of those things that makes you want to follow a leader, right? If you have a guy at work who shows up, part of the time, and they complain a lot, and they don't do a high quality job, and all of a sudden your boss says, well, he's your new supervisor, how are you going to feel about that? A recipe for disaster. Same thing spiritually. If you have the opportunity to help somebody, no matter what the circumstance is, but you yourself are not a consistent, diligent Christian, do you really have the ability to help? And would they want to follow you if you did offer help? So competence is one of those things that makes people want to follow us. Thoughts on that before we move to the case studies and talk about Abraham? So if you'll turn in your Bibles to Genesis 22, after talking about the definition of competence and some high-level applications, let's talk about Abraham. So the author used a interesting case study here of Abraham being commanded to go and sacrifice Isaac. Now, what we know about Abraham is, the Bible never uses the word competent to say Abraham was a competent fella. But, you think about the way that he led his clan. They had a large amount of livestock. A large number of people followed him as he migrated from his homeland. So we could infer that he was a competent person and successful in terms of agriculture and leading his people and providing for them. So this example of the sacrifice of Abraham, we could read about some other things that are spiritually competent about him. So longer passage, let's split this up so it's not me reading the whole time. We're going to read the first 18 verses. Can I get somebody to read Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 8? Genesis 22, verse 1 through 8. Yeah, first 8 verses of Genesis 22. Thank you, Miss Pat. I want to make sure y'all don't get tired of just me reading the whole time. So can I get somebody else to read a few more passages, verse 9 through 14 of the same chapter?
Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, In the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided.
Thank you. Thank you, Miss Pat and Aaron, for reading. So Abraham, as we know, was a competent person when it came to leading his family and providing in all of his agricultural success. But here's a different example. So from this passage, in what ways, this is a first study question, in what ways would you consider Abraham to have displayed competence. What's some evidence of competence in this passage that we see? Yep. Yep. First thing, he obeyed, and he prepared on how to obey. Right? He had to get some materials together. And Donnie, you had your hand up? Yep. Abraham's answer, "Here I am," that sounds like, "I'm ready to go. What you need?"
Yeah, he didn't drag his feet the next morning.
Yep. Abraham didn't drag his feet. He also didn't make any excuses. He didn't, try and negotiate or anything. He didn't try and get out of it.
You got up early in the morning.
Got up early.
People get up early, right?
Yep.
Nah, I'm just kidding. And my point was, he wasted no time.
Yeah.
He moved on immediately. He procrastinated, waited around, I think, maybe he changed his mind, got up first thing, got done.
Yep. Yeah, I appreciate y'all's responses. So Abraham showed competence. He answered, he was ready to go. He obeyed right away. He didn't make excuses, and then he also prepared what he needed. So it talks about him taking the wood and saddling up the donkeys and so on. So he planned out all the details too about what he would need to fulfill. And he didn't do any half measures and get there and say, "Oh no, I forgot my wood, let's go home." He prepared for it, and he was ready, and like it or not, he obeyed. So second question here, following up on that, if you had been asked by God to sacrifice someone you loved or something you valued highly, would you have fulfilled the task as competently as Abraham did? How do you think you would have handled that? Yep. It would be hard. It'd be difficult. And I can't pretend that I would be as willing or capable as Abraham at this time. I don't think I could have done that. I would definitely be asking why. But I think we need to go and prepare ourselves. We never know when we'll have a difficult situation that's going to require us to get out of our comfort zone and use every ounce of skill and every drop of knowledge we got. So in everything that we do spiritually, we need to do it to the best of our ability, no matter if we like it or if we don't. Donnie?
It's always been hard for me to put myself in Abraham's place. Okay, he said, "Don," I said, "Here I am. I have held teaching you do all that you can do. You had the faith that Abraham had. I would have done what Abraham did. But today, obviously, I hope he never asked me to do anything like that. It would be, I don't see any reason for him to do something like that. For me, this is probably the greatest act of faith of the Bible.
Yep. Yeah, I think Abraham is difficult to relate eye to eye with this example because it's such an extreme example of faith and obedience.
There are contemporary examples. God doesn't, he doesn't now ask us directly to sacrifice, but indirectly it happens. He says that can happen. There's a young lady in the very first school shooting that God was going to keep people, and he asked her, he believed in God, and he shot her. And so that was, now that was sacrificing himself, but in China and a couple other places, when certain orders came to power, they basically said, are you going to renounce God, or are you going to kill your family? And they lost their families. They did that. So and it can still happen here, too. There's nothing impossible. So though God himself directly is going to renounce that, it's not. But ask yourself, if you're in that situation, the government throws God under the bus completely, and
Yeah, that's tough to think about, but we got to think about the tough things to prepare. And that's a good corollary that now there's people that are persecuted or killed or attacked because of their faith. We might not be like Abraham where we're required to sacrifice one of our own children, but a very real possibility we'll be in a situation where we got to put ourselves in danger to proclaim our faith and to remain faithful to Christ. Hey, yes, Kent.
You know, the 3 words that sums that whole story up? 3 words in that story that sums it all up.
What you got?
Now I know.
Now I know.
God said, now I know. That sums up the whole narrative. You got everything prepared, everything ready to accept. You just have to plan. You knew from the beginning, God would provide. Understand?
Yeah.
And when he got there, he was about to do it. God said, now I know. That's the whole point of that whole story. The test for him and for us to realize what we can.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Kent. Thank you. So, Kent, if you can't hear that, main point is, now I know. God says that when he sees Abraham acting on his faith. God says, now I know. So, are we going to be competent enough when we are challenged that God will see our actions and say, now I know? So let's keep moving on in the questions. Number 3, what were the underlying traits and motivation that enabled Abraham to act with competence in such a stressful situation? What about Abraham empowered him to be competent under this kind of challenge? Faith? I heard a couple answers at the same time. Yep. Faith and discipline. And I want to think is there's a huge amount of trust and faith in God also. So Abraham believed in all of his heart that God was going to fulfill his promises for Abraham to father a great nation. Finally, after how many years, they have Isaac, and then he's told to sacrifice Isaac. So Abraham must have known somehow that God had a backup plan somehow where he could still have his promises fulfilled even if Isaac has to be sacrificed. Donnie?
Hebrews chapter 11 gives the answer to
Mhm.
that. He knew, even if we put Isaac to death, he knew that God was raising him from the dead, not in the last day, but then, so that the promises would be fulfilled. That's how much trust he had in God and the promises that God had made.
Yeah, that's a good answer. So Hebrews 11 tells us, and I turned there, and it's hard for me to skim this and look for a verse and talk at the same time. But one of the key things there is Abraham was looking forward to something better, a city whose builder was God. And again, I'm not going to try and talk and find the verse at the same time. You want to read that for us, Donnie? Okay.
By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac received shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a previous sin.
Yeah, thank you, Donnie. So if we think back a few weeks to our lesson on conviction, we can't have this kind of spiritual competence if we don't have the conviction that drives us to act upon our faith. And the final question for the study on Abraham. What do you draw upon when you need to be competent under stress?
You know what, I think about anything, because my grandmother, great grandmother, they were always church going and prayerful. They always used to start, God will provide. He may not come in the moment, he may not come at the moment you desire him to come,
That's a great answer. So what do we draw on when we're going through some of these crushing, stressful situations? Remember that God will provide. That's Miss Pat's comment. Might not be what we want, but it'll be what we need. Might not be along to a plan we understand, but it'll be going along in accordance with God's ultimate plan. I think we could try and remember the big picture. You know, being a Christian isn't about just surviving one struggle at a time. It's about working towards the ultimate final reward. And so we'll go through these battles. We need to endure through these battles, but remember who's going to ultimately win the war. And again, might not be the immediate outcome we want to see, but ultimately God wins. And also when we're going through these situations, when our competence is put under stress, remember that we could draw upon others. You know, there's a lot of competent people here, people that are good at encouraging, people that are good at comforting and studying. So we have others that we could draw on also for that kind of help and encouragement and continued skill, sharpening the sword. So let's turn to Hezekiah. Is there any other comments on Abraham?
On that last question, we rely, I rely on my knowledge, my understanding, and my faith. Just to give a current example, I have friends who are very politically minded,
Very what minded?
politically
Okay.
minded. And so, like in this last president, not this one, but last presidential election, a certain individual got elected, he was livid. And they're like, how can you be so calm? I said, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what any of humans put in it. God is in control. I don't have to worry.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that only comes from the understanding, the knowledge that God has given us to go on and faith that He will take care of us.
Yep.
He may not do it now, it may be 1,000 years, but either way, He's going to take care of us.
Yep, and that's a good point. It helps you to stay calm under pressure or calm when everybody else is losing their cool about things beyond our control. Good, so let's turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and read about Hezekiah. So while we turn there, this is an area that we don't spend too much time on, talking about the divided kingdom. But Hezekiah was king of Judah, the southern kingdom. And remember if Hezekiah was a good king or bad king? He was a good king. And in the context, Hezekiah was the second to last good king. There is Hezekiah, there's a series of poor kings, and then there is Josiah. He was the final good king of Judea. And then after that, there's nothing but bad kings that ended up selling out and letting themselves be conquered by the Babylonians. So Hezekiah was also in the time of Isaiah, the second to last good period of Judea, and the great-grandfather of Josiah, the final good king before the captivity. So I think that fact alone, that Hezekiah was a good king, preceded and followed by the evil kings, hints at his competence. Now, we're going to read a passage about his reform. I'm going to read the first 11 verses of 2 Chronicles 29 for the sake of time. We've got about 10 minutes left. Hezekiah began to reign when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. He brought in the priests and the Levites and assembled them in the square on the east and said to them, "Hear me, Levites. Now consecrate yourselves, consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place. For our fathers have been unfaithful and have done what was evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They have forsaken him and have turned away their faces from the habitation of the Lord and turned their backs. They also shut the doors of the vestibule and put out the lamps and have not burned incense or offered burnt offerings on the holy place to the God of Israel. Therefore the wrath of the Lord came on Judah and Jerusalem, and he has made them an object of horror, of astonishment, and of hissing. as you see with your own eyes. For behold, our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and our daughters and our wives are in captivity for this. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, in order that his fierce anger may turn away from us. My sons, do not now be negligent, for the Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence, to minister to him, and be his ministers and make offerings to him. And we aren't going to read through the details as listed for the sake of time. But let's turn to 2 Chronicles 31 at the end of the narrative on Hezekiah. 2 Chronicles 31, verse 20, summarizing Hezekiah. Thus Hezekiah did throughout all Judah, and he did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God. And every work that he undertook in the service of the house of God, and in accordance with the law and the commandments, seeking his God, he did with all his heart and prospered. So we could probably do a whole class on Hezekiah. Interesting history, a rare shining spot in just a really bleak time period surrounded by wickedness. So one, Hezekiah obviously was competent. He was a king. To become the king, you'd have to survive all sorts of political intrigue. And if you read, the book of Kings and Chronicles, you'll read about a lot of tricky dealings. It wasn't an orderly transfer of power in those days. So Hezekiah was obviously a competent person in worldly terms and his ability to lead people. But let's think spiritually, spiritual competence. Many of the other kings of Israel and Judah were materially successful, but spiritually failures. So let's think about Hezekiah's spiritual leadership. Now, the first question in the list is, at what point in his reign did Hezekiah initiate his actions related to the restoration of the temple? And what significance is this? Yep. In the first month of the first year of his reign, he got started on opening the temple doors. So just like Abraham, right? The next morning he woke up early and he got to it. Hezekiah didn't wait around for the perfect time or opportunity or say, oh, I need to get my council on board. He just kind of took charge and said, we're going to do this. So compare this priority with cleansing the temple, Hezekiah cleansing the temple. More Old Testament, how does the book of Haggai start off? Why is God upset in the beginning of the book of Haggai? If you recall, or if you aren't familiar with it, Haggai, God starts off in the book of Haggai, he's upset because the Israelites never finished rebuilding the temple after the return from captivity. It had been 20 years between the start and completion of the temple. And God says in Haggai, why is my house in ruins while you guys are in paneled houses? So there's a big contrast with Hezekiah doing an immediate start to the reform of the temple versus the Israelites after captivity taking 20 years to rebuild the temple. So good priorities here. Again, Hezekiah didn't wait around for the perfect opportunity, but he jumped in feet first and started cleansing. So question 2, how much would the priests and the Levites have known about Hezekiah at that time, and why do you think they followed him?
We probably knew a lot about him as a person, but they didn't necessarily know how he was.
We read that Hezekiah was 25 years old at this time. And we don't know much about his personality or anything from the scriptures, but we could assume that his peers knew him as a person. Didn't necessarily know how he was going to lead, but he must have some reputation or character that made people want to follow him. But one of the key points when he's talking about why they're cleansing the temple, he doesn't say, let's just go out and cleanse the temple and not give a reason. And he also doesn't say, let's cleanse the temple so that we can make ourselves look good or that I can make myself look good. There's a lot of vanity projects now and then. But Hezekiah talks about consequences. he talks about their fathers had followed evil ways. And he says that they came to ruin. And so he lays out the consequences if you do it, if you don't do it. And he basically says, people, we need to cleanse the temple. We need to return to rightful worship of Jehovah. I'm paraphrasing. And if we do these things, then we'll get away from this pattern of ruin that our fathers have been following. So I think that he shows competence by laying out the case for why to do this, and explains what they're going to do. And then also the directions that they follow. There's parallels here that we can't get into with what they do here and what the Israelites do in Exodus after the tabernacle is constructed when they consecrate the tabernacle. There's also parallels to 2 Kings when Solomon consecrates the temple after its construction. So they follow a lot of really highly detailed steps to cleanse it. So he's giving a lot of instructions, giving clear detail, and the why. And so he is those to get people on board and to follow him. So we got about 5 minutes left. Hey Ben, can I ask you a favor? Can you go check the copy machine? See if we got the lesson 5 printed out and pass it out. Thank you, brother. So, question 3. What evidence do you see of Hezekiah's competence as a leader? Yep. He didn't hesitate. He didn't equivocate. He didn't ask. Laid out a plan, laid out resources, laid out why to do it, and they got it done. You can see his competence because they were successful in what they set out to do. It's not like, again, what we read about in Haggai, where the Israelites set out with good intentions to rebuild the temple, but then never got around to finishing it. They started, they didn't finish. Hezekiah started, and he finished. He also utilized resources well. We didn't read the passage, but when they go to do their initial sacrifices, there are so many sacrifices that the priests alone couldn't handle the sacrifices, so he recruited other Levites to help. Same thing when we talk about the resources. You be able to hand those out, please? Oh.
It's like 3 and 4, right?
Yeah. No, this is, I'll go back and check the copy machine later. Thank you. I'll make copies and hand it out in between class or sometime during service. Thanks for your patience with that. Final question on Hezekiah, and we won't get to the qualifications for the elders and deacons, unfortunately. But question 4, what benefits of competence did Hezekiah receive personally? And what benefits did the people receive? How did it impact the people of Judah? Yep, a healthy and blessed reign. It is one of the last periods of wholesomeness in Judah before the corruption took over after his great-grandson Josiah died. So 2 key things. One, if you look at the military history, there's the Assyrian king Sennacherib who came and besieged Jerusalem. Sennacherib was not successful. Sennacherib was turned away by an angel of the Lord that slaughtered the Assyrian army. So because of Hezekiah's faithfulness, God protected Jerusalem and prevented the Assyrians from taking over Jerusalem. And on a really interesting side note, there's historical evidence for King Sennacherib. There's been architectural findings, and there has been, recorded writing about his reign. And in the archaeological findings about Sennacherib, there's a list of his conquests. You could follow a timing of what Sennacherib did. But in the time period, there's nothing mentioned about Jerusalem. The kings at this time only recorded their victories. They didn't record their defeats. So if you go look at the chronological history of what we know about Sennacherib, there's a blank chapter. And that blank chapter we can infer is when he was defeated at Jerusalem. A list of his victories, period of silence, continued list of victories. That period of silence is where they did not record their defeat at Jerusalem. And some critics have said that this absence of the defeat at Jerusalem is evidence that there was no defeat at Jerusalem, but other historical records, the victor has recorded a victory, the defeated has not recorded that, and different timelines match each other. So that's what happened here. Interesting. I like to geek out about these things, so forgive me. Second thing, Hezekiah's life was extended 15 years. He had a terminal illness, prayed to God, and God extended his life 15 years. So there's both personal benefits for him, and there is also cultural benefits for all the faithful at that time. So if we display competence in what we're doing, we could have a spiritual benefit for us, spiritual benefit for others. But that's one of the key aspects of being a spiritual leader. People will not want to follow us or seek our ability to help or seek a study or seek comfort if we aren't displaying competence in what we do spiritually. Any last closing comments or thoughts?
I think one thing about Hezekiah is you have to kind of dig in there a little bit to find it out. Later on in his life, he was lifted up with pride. And God had to deal with that. And also, it said God withdrew from him for a while. That's make sure that you keep going my way. So you don't have to be perfect. You can make mistakes and still be great leader. And still be confident in what we're doing because we have examples like Hezekiah.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for those comments, Donnie. Again, wish we had more time on Hezekiah because he was challenged. He did have his failings that was recorded, but we can take away lessons about competence. So first thing we got to do is keep working at it, keep showing up, keep studying, keep encouraging. Otherwise, we'll never get to that level. All right, thank you, everybody. I'll go and make copies of next week's class. Appreciate all the discussion.